Let me start with any questions that you had left over from last night that you wanted to talk about before we started today.
I just wanted to say that when you asked, what our experience was growing up with Darren, I don't remember anything special or outstanding except that she was Jesus' mother and that she was virgin and that my childhood focus was always Jesus. And so when you brought up the idea of Mary's the perfect example of how we should be with Christ, it just really got my mind going and thinking about she openly accepted Christ. She was open to accept Christ, and then she just was obedient to, carrying Christ and bringing Christ to the world, and that's how we should be.
And the open to accepting is critical, and it's going to be a critical part, I think. Tell me if you can't hear me for some reason, because sometimes my voice kind of goes up and down. I can't hear, my son says I can't hear, but I won't go any further than that. It's kind of critical to understanding one of the things we'll talk about today, which is a designation of Mary and a feast that the Episcopal Church does generally not celebrate, but which the Roman Catholic Church celebrates and which the Orthodox celebrate, but under a different name, and that's the Immaculate Conception, which has been the cause of considerable disharmony among Christians over many, many, many years. So keep that idea of was open to before saying yes. Anybody else? Okay, so let me start out with God, which is a place we always should start, right? And when we talk about the events that Mary's life and our celebrations of Christ and Mary, Christ in Mary, we start there also, and we say God was a revolutionary. What do I mean by that? Why would I say God was a revolutionary? Do I think God was a Marxist-Leninist marching up and down?
No.
No, okay.
Because he was going to do something that has never been done.
Okay.
He broke the status quo.
He broke the status quo. Not only did he break the status quo, but what did he do with the status quo?
Turned it upside down.
That's it. Everything we look at, if we look at Scripture from almost the beginning until the end in Revelation, we see this pattern of turning everything upside down. Darkness into light. The rocky or the crooked paths into straight. The poor sitting among princes. And critically, for the beginning of the Mary story, a story that replicates some other stories from the Old Testament in its kind of contours, the barren woman that becomes the mother of a son or a daughter, but generally in the Old Testament a son. Celebrated even in the Psalms. The barren wife sits in her house as the happy mother of sons. Barrenness, either literally or figuratively, was devastating, a devastating state for a woman and or a family in times. And think about, again, Sarah even. Sarah is barren And that gives rise to the whole problem of Abraham and Hagar. We know that story, right?
Right.
And others that follow it. And eventually Sarah is gifted at the age of, I think, 99 or 199, I don't know, after a certain point, who cares? With a son. And then the son might be taken away, but isn't. Hannah, of course, in the book of Samuel, is another story where she is barren. And she moans and cries for a child. Her husband has a surrogate that he treats his wife beautifully, but the other person is the mother of a child. She is not. Until eventually she goes to the temple and prays for a child that she will dedicate to God. And she prays so vigorously that the priest thinks she's
Nuts.
not well, or drunk. Yeah. And eventually she gives birth to Samuel, who is dedicated and takes over the priesthood. Again, a total turning around, because the previous priesthood, the priesthood of Eli, has not been faithful. The Hannah story has a lot to do with the way we look at the Mary story. Although Mary in the early church, particularly in the proto-gospel of James, is seen not only prefigured in Hannah, but in Samuel as well, as in the priesthood. When we look at the first of the Marian feasts, well, I'm not going to go by calendar. I'm going to start with the Immaculate Conception. December 8th, we celebrate in the Roman Rite the Immaculate Conception. December 9th in the Orthodox Church, it is really the conception to St. Anne. So it is the conception by St. Anne of Mary that is really the contour of that feast. Now, I have to ask this question. How many of you, at some point in your life, thought the Immaculate Conception referred to the conception of Jesus? Everybody does. I was just asking Father Guy, why do you think that is? And I guess he said, well, nobody ever explained it. But it does not. It refers to the conception of Mary, expressed by the Romans or the Latin West as without the stain of original sin.
Say that again.
Without the stain of original sin. So if you grew up, I think Episcopalians, I said, have a little less guilt. But if you grew up, as I did, in the Roman Catholic Church, you had a lot of guilt. And you started out guilty. If any of you had the Baltimore Catechism, you probably had a picture of this milk bottle. Okay? And the milk bottle starts out black. Figure that out. Because by virtue of being born as a human being, we inherited the sin of Adam and Eve. Now, when I was little, I thought this really sucks, if I may use a theological term. I mean, bazillions of years ago, these characters were running around happy as clams and naked in the garden, and they screwed up, and now I and everyone else, for eternity, share in this, quote, stain of original sin. And once I get baptized, it goes away, but at any moment, my clean white milk bottle can start having black spots in it, and those are actual sins that I personally commit. And eventually, my milk bottle can get completely black again. But if I go to the sacrament of penance, it can get wiped white again. Now, here as a child, I also had a problem because even though I got wiped away again, you still got stuck in purgatory. Because while the sin went away, the punishment didn't go away, and that again seemed to me to be a really raw deal. I mean, what good is I forgive you but I'm going to make you suffer? Okay. So, what is it that the doctrine develops, and I'm kind of simplifying this a bit, the doctrine develops that Mary does not share in the stain of original sin, that her conception was immaculate. Now, there's a couple problems here. One is that who said that what we inherit from Adam and Eve is the stain of sin? Yeah. Find it in the Bible where it says, and the stain of original sin was going to be passed on to generations. What happens? I bet you guy knows the answer to this. What is it that comes into the world through Adam and Eve that was not there before?
Death.
Death.
Who said it up there? Somebody said it up there. Who was it?
Susan.
Oh.
Sorry.
No, no. It's a gold star. You got it.
Death.
That's what happens when you live with a bird.
I was ignoring her because I figured she had an inherent advantage. So, she only gets maybe a blue star and a gold star. There's no silver star, but there's time yet this evening. So, we participate in a lot of things as human beings because we are human. We participate in life. We participate in the possibility of becoming godlike. We participate in all sorts of things as human beings, but the stain of original sin is not necessarily one of them. Now, it's very hard for moral theologians to describe what original sin actually is.
Is it death? Is that the stain?
No, death is death.
I know, but
Death becomes the universal separator that produces fear of ending, that produces the instinct to protect oneself against who?
Everybody.
Against everybody. Which produces division and hatred and more death, which, yes, and that is sin. There is more evil floating around in the world that is attributable to me or you. And we try to account for it. And we know that there is death, and yet we know that death is overcome. And we know that this didn't happen, that in January, God made Adam and Eve. In February, Adam and Eve succumbed to temptation. In March, God sent the prophets. In April, God sent Jesus to fix things. In May, Jesus died after fixing things. In the next month, the next thing happened. No, God didn't say, oh my God, human beings screwed up, now what am I going to do? Let me think. No, the scheme of God wanting human beings and God wanting His creation to be fully united with Him exists from the very beginning. The beginning of everything, and the beginning of everything is God. As we start Genesis with, in the beginning, God. Before God creates or does anything else, in the beginning is God, and we all participate and are drawn into His reality by various means. Guy, you're looking skeptical, no?
You said means, and I was listing them.
Okay.
Oh.
Maybe lose my train of thought, such as it was. I've derailed. Okay. So, that's all part and parcel of what we share. We share salvation. As the human, not a human being, but as the human was made in the image and grows into the likeness of God. The human is what is redeemed and saved. That whole notion of, I'm accepting Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, and people come and say, when were you saved? Were you ever saved? Have you ever been asked by that?
Yes.
Are you saved? I think so. Well, when were you saved? I said, well, in the beginning, God.
Yeah.
And if you really want to keep breaking it down, there's this Christ event that subsumes all of us. So no, there is no moment in which I personally, by myself, because of my personal relationship with my Lord and Savior, have become saved, whatever that is supposed to mean for them. But if you ever want to respond to them and say, in the beginning, God, and they'll look at you like, so.
That derails them.
But I mean, that's what I think we believe. Now, this is beginning to be a long way around where I'm going. And that is, as a very famous Roman Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner, said, and others have said it as well. I think T.S. Eliot might have hit it someplace. The beginning is a critical moment. And the beginning is not that which is discarded after subsequent growth happens.
Say that again?
The beginning
Okay.
is critical, but the beginning is not a moment that we discard in the light of subsequent growth. So the beginning does not become irrelevant as life, or whatever it is, creation's path continues. It's not like beginning, okay, put that aside. Now we have the middle and we're charging over, here's the end, that's what we're waiting for. No, the beginning is the critical moment that subsumes the end, that contains the end, and that is also in reverse defined by the end. Want to do that again? Okay, the beginning contains the end, is contained by the end, and the end subsumes the beginning.
Define subsumes.
Encompasses in cases.
That's kind of what I was thinking, but
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. Okay.
So
Thank
that's
you.
the circle.
It is. It is a circle, and yet it also is an arrow in a sense. Now, I'm not just going to use arrow because that's the wrong, that's more linear. Teilhard would say that everything that converges, I've lost my sentence here. In Teilhard's vision, there's this spiral. It's not an arrow, it's a spiral in which the communion of species, whoever they are, through these choices to be united, everything that rises must converge. And the choices that every species makes is whether or not to converge in this upward circular movement, this spiral that leads us closer and closer and closer and closer until everything converges in the point omega or in God. he also kind of explains species that have disappeared by saying the choices were to not be united.
I was gonna say, as you say, the beginning, the end is contained in the beginning is contained in the end, and subsume and saturate. Is that not indicate that by, or illustrate that by the statement of the risen Christ in the book of the Revelation, I am presently the Alpha and the Omega.
Correct.
I wasn't this and I will be that. I am both and all.
I am wisdom present before the beginning. I am the Word present before the beginning.
The Lamb slain before the foundation of the world.
Okay? Now, if we look at the beginning of Mary, in her conception by her parents, Anna and Joachim. Anna, by the way, is highly revered in the Islamic tradition, just for a little side note. Muslims are very devoted to the mother, Mary. They are barren as well, and are not well thought of because of this barrenness. And the Anna story becomes the same as the Hannah story, except that Anna gives birth to a female child instead of a male child. But Anna also has promised that whether the child will be male or female, it will be dedicated to God. When Mary is conceived in the love of God and in the love of these two, and in the design of salvation, she is full of the possibility of who she will become. And you will recall the angel meets her and says, you are full of grace. Not, you're going to be full of grace once, Jesus takes shape. You are already full of grace. You have the capacity to say yes. Mary is born in the scheme of God's creation and salvific plan with the capacity to say yes. The gracefulness that permits her to make that choice on which God's entire redemptive plan depends. And in her, the plan of redemption becomes a joint project, if you will, between the human and the divine, which comes to its fullness in the incarnation of our Lord at his birth from her womb. I have to tell you a funny small side story here. There's stories about how kids learn prayers by rote, and they think they're saying one thing, but... And when I was little, in the Hail Mary, there's the line about, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. I always wondered what the womb Jesus was. Anyway, as I said, just a little humor here. So, let me pause for a minute, because that was kind of heavy.
A little bit.
It may have been new, it may not have been new, but what's going on as you think about that? As I said, in the Roman Catholic Church now, they come to define the Immaculate Conception in 1854, kind of independently of the Eastern Church and independently of a lot of other people, as this thing that's related to sinfulness and non-sinfulness. And in a lot of minds, I think Immaculate Conception somehow also means it didn't have anything to do with sex. Now, we know that Mary was conceived by natural means, so it clearly had to do with sex. But it's the beginning for a lot of people in that tradition of this emphasis that begins to grow and grow and grow, and you'll see it in different feasts, on the virginity. That what's important about Mary is her virginity. And that leads us to believe that teenagers never had sex before marriage, if they were religious. Now, I'm not sure from looking at you, but I suspect that some of us in this room know that that may never have been true. Now,
Okay.
I have to share something I haven't shared with almost anybody, but after my mom passed away, my father died many years ago, I was rummaging through things and I found this marriage certificate. And the marriage certificate was not the right day, because they were married November 20th, 1936. And this marriage certificate said February something, something, something. And it wasn't from church, it was from the county recorder of deeds. And I began thinking, why have I never heard about this before? What could have been the reason that there was this other marriage that nobody ever heard about in February? And my well-trained, theologically honed mind said, hell's bells, I bet they thought there was a baby. There wasn't. In any event, the rest of the story of their marriage is hilarious because it got to do with Italians. They were always very amusing. For their honeymoon, they went with the entire set of Italian in-laws to the Alamo Theater to watch a movie. Yeah, right. As my mother used to say, I lived with my in-laws for the 40 years of my marriage to my husband. I lived with in-laws for the 20 years after the death of my husband, and I've outlived them all! Anyway, so back to the beginning and the end. Anybody?
When,
I gotta ponder it. I gotta think about this. It's deep.
Pondering is good.
when did Full of Grace become, when did Without the Stain of Original Sin start becoming the language that the Roman Church used?
You know, I'm not sure of the real date of that.
I mean, was it a phrase being used in the 900s, the 1500s?
I'm going to say it was probably subsequent to the schism, because you don't really find it in the early conciliar statements when we were still talking to each other.
So after the 11th century.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a group came up with this idea that Mary was
Well-
Immaculate Conception?
I think, you know, there were always streams of people who believed were heavier toward the sin side than the grace side. I mean, Augustine, for example. I mean, you can't find anybody who was a little bit more sour on human life than him. And of course, we attribute that to his mother too. It's always mom's fault. Those of you who know this, you know it's always your fault. In Augustine's case, it really was his mother's fault, because he was going along living a happy, if somewhat perverted life, until his mother prayed hard enough that he ended up converting and becoming the individual who not only was sour himself, but made Luther into the rather unpleasant personality that he sometimes theologically exhibited. So I think there was always, and there's always been kind of a tension between those who wanted to make things legal, and if legal, then understandable, and if understandable, then controllable, because teachable, and those who believed more in the depth of the mystery. Like, the beginning contains the end. What does that mean? Well, that's, if we look at the whole thing as being related to God, we'll never figure this one out.
Except there is no time.
Right. But there is for us.
In God's world, yeah.
So the depth, we just keep getting drawn deeper and deeper into the mystery of God. It's not something that's soluble. It's something that just keeps enveloping us further and further and further. And I think that guy is, there's sort of that tension that has always existed.
But the Roman West tends to explain things legally because of the
Right.
Roman Empire tradition. They
Correct.
love their laws.
Correct. Correct.
But is there any place in the Bible that you can read about the Immaculate
No.
Conception?
No. It is a non-biblical feast. There are biblical feasts of Mary and there are non-biblical feasts. But the non-biblical feasts, on the whole, had their origins very, very early, even if they weren't sort of officially part of the cult or the ritual until later. The declaration by, is it Clement? Of the Immaculate Conception. There's only two dogmas in the Roman Catholic Church, two quote, infallible pronouncements. One is the Immaculate Conception in 1854. One is the Assumption, which was, I believe, 1950 or 52. I always get those dates mixed up. By Pius XII. Now, you see some interesting expressions of that, where at, I believe it was Lourdes, might have been Fatima, I get Fatima and Lourdes mixed up, Portugal, France, you know, they're all foreigners. Where Our Lady appears to their child and says, I am the Immaculate Conception. Yes. Mary in the Immaculate Conception is considered by the Romans to be the patroness of the United States, hence the Basilica in Washington, D.C. But originally, and still festily in the Eastern Church, it's considered the conception by Anne. Has nothing to do with sexuality, by the way.
Where do you find the history of the mother?
Well, there's a number of non-canonical books, like the Gospel of James. I don't think Thomas has anything, but fairly early literature contemporaneous with some of the biblical New Testament materials that contain stories and legends and sort of apocryphal ideas around, here's the way Mary and Joseph lived, here's the way Mary was honored, here's what Jesus was like, kind of embellishments, if you will. If you want to read probably the best history of Mary and Marian devotion, the author's last name is Graff, G-R-A-E-F. And I'll bring the exact name of the book tomorrow. It's, well, your brother even cites it in his
I'll look it up.
Aha, okay. It's really an enormous compendium of both Eastern and sort of Western development of the devotion and how it comes to be and how it gets changed over the years. We have different defining events in which Mary is invoked. In the Latin West, there was a feast called Our Lady of Victory, which celebrated the victory of the European fleet against the Ottomans and Cyprus, attributed to the Dominicans in Italy sitting up all night praying the rosary. Might have had something to do with the nature of the fleet as well, but
Hilda Grafe.
yeah.
Mary, A History of Doctrine and Devotion.
Yeah. It's big, but it's really thorough.
Big? Big?
It's about this big.
Wow,
Okay.
we know that much.
Well, it's about all that we came to know and how we knew it and how we express what we know.
Oh, okay.
Well, isn't the Immaculate Conception is that, the whole premise is that Mary had to be without sin because she was giving birth to a son who was also without sin, so.
But that goes back to, would Jesus inherit?
And the Assumption pertains to Mary, correct?
It does also.
Meaning she didn't have to suffer death.
Well, there are different traditions about that as well. And that's going to go into that a little bit more in detail on its own, but we can talk about that a little bit now. Come back to the beginning and the end containing each other. In the Eastern Church, the feast is called the Falling Asleep of Mary, or the Dormition. In the West, it's called the Assumption. Episcopalians and Anglicans usually celebrate that particular feast on August 15th as the Feast of St. Mary the Virgin. There are traditions that hold that Mary died or that she didn't suffer death. In any event, she was in extremis when, according to tradition, the apostles gathered from wherever they were in the world to be at her bedside. When Pius declares the doctrine of the Assumption, he says, well, she was assumed body and soul into heaven. Now, there's a couple problems with that. The way Latins have come to understand it, and it usually is portrayed as her whole body and everything else goes.
Like Elijah.
Well, Elijah disappears.
And Mary doesn't?
Mary is, according to this strand of tradition, assumed into heaven
Full body.
full body.
Yeah.
Now, you got to start with one problem there, and that is you have to believe in this three-storied universe, that there is an actual spatial relationship of heaven, earth, underworld. She's taken to some place. It's,
So in that tradition, would that be purgatory then?
no, she's immediately assumed into heaven,
Okay.
and she experiences the resurrection of the body earlier than the rest of us do. Problem number 2, if we got rid of the three-story, we understand ourselves as embodied, as soul and body that are inseparable, and we talk about participating in the resurrection of the dead on the last day, just as Jesus is risen from the dead, and we believe in the bodily resurrection. But here's the thing. The one thing that we know about the resurrected Jesus, the one thing we know about the risen Jesus, is no one recognized him. So whatever that risen body was like, it wasn't like it was before. Was it real? Yes, the gospel writers go through great lengths to prove that it's real. Here, touch my wound, so on and so forth. But we know that whatever Jesus was like in the resurrection was absolutely different, to the point of unrecognizable until he spoke or offered food or touched. If Mary participates, as we all are promised we will, in the resurrection of the body, then why would we assume that the way she looked when she was dead is the way that she looked when she was brought to be united with her Son in eternity? It makes no sense to me, at least. Thoughts?
Speak.
My thought is, and I agree with you entirely about the three sort of physical, spatial levels of heaven, earth, and purgatory and hell, however it's organized. It wouldn't be a taking of her body and soul up and away. It would be taking of her body and soul into a new
Correct.
type of
Yes.
existence which they could not recognize.
Yes.
That's the
And
difference.
that's the connection, I think,
Yeah.
to the resurrection and the ascension.
Right.
It's being made part of her Son in a way that is impossible to fully understand, but represents absolute and complete union of body and soul, of the wholeness of her person, in ways that we don't experience until some other time, sometime when the fullness is here. Now, does that in some way take away from the wonder? Mary enters into glory just as she's covered with glory, and glory is the godliness of God that shines forth and that transforms, and that is the absolute characteristic of God. And we talk then about it being glorious. In the same way, sometimes we talk about the Ascension as being glorious also. Ascension's a whole other complex set of issues. So yes, I don't think that way we're talking about it now takes away from the tremendous grace that is given to Mary. But once again, go back to her beginning as having the capacity to say yes, her saying yes, her bearing the Son, and then being born by the Son, who is saying yes himself. See, he looked like he wanted to say something.
It makes sense to have the Immaculate Conception logically be followed by the Assumption, and if she's born without sin, and the result of that original sin is death, then therefore she doesn't die, because she wasn't born with that sin. Does it assume then that she was sinless throughout her life? Because that's, again, fully Episcopalian born and bred, and didn't grow up with that dogma.
I think almost every tradition that I'm aware of that thinks about Mary agrees, including the Anglican and Roman, I think, joint documents, that Mary is free from does not commit actual sin.
So is that where her supposed perpetual virginity comes in?
That's another story.
Okay.
And that is, I was just kidding with a guy before dinner about where he stood on postpartum.
Yeah.
And he kind of looked at me and I said, prepartum, in partum, postpartum. I said, Mary, perpetual, ever virgin. I think that the oldest traditions of the church are that she was ever virgin. Now, we have some complications to this. First of all, what does it mean to be a virgin? Does it mean that Jesus somehow slipped out without
Leaving a trace.
leaving a trace? Probably not. Did she have labor? Did she have
No
everything
DNA
else?
in this
Yes. We have a pediatrician here, so you probably study this stuff. Depending on what we think of as virginal, we believe, and I think the church has always believed, that prior to Jesus' birth and in Jesus' birth, Mary is a virgin. Discussion comes up later about whether or not Mary remains a virgin after Jesus' birth, around the question of, does Jesus have brothers? Because there's a passage that says, and his brothers were, okay.
Well, there's another passage about where his brothers and sisters were not there.
The thing is that if you've ever been in the Middle East, everybody's
Somebody else's brother.
somebody else's brother, even if you're their fifth cousin. The word ahi, or the word my brother, that's in modern Hebrew, comes from Arabic, and it's the word that everybody in the Israeli army uses about anybody else who's ever either been in the army or who's a friend of theirs. And that comes from the Islamic tradition of everybody who's a believer is a brother. So it's kind of scant evidence to say, based on that passage as interpreted by the King James, that there were subsequent
Actual siblings.
siblings. The question becomes, was after having had given birth to the Son of God, is the womb defiled by sex, really. Because if Jesus has brothers, that means that Mary and Joseph had intercourse.
Oh
And
my
we all
God.
know,
It's bad.
Oh, it's awful.
we all know somehow that that's bad. And the people that think it's the baddest are the people who have the most high birth rates. So figure that one out. What the focus really, I think, of the virginity issue is more really like what the Syrians and some of the other Easterners think of as the single-mindedness that you find in the monastic. That you can enjoy, as it were, virginity after you've had children, in a sense. You can, it's the way in which your life is focused in its entirety, I think, on the divine.
May I relate that to the question of how was she preserved from actual sin? In my understanding, and I think what you said, sister, is that the original sin black milk bottle thing is a really bad way to explain it, because we don't participate in the guilt of Adam and Eve. But sin enters through the fear of death, thereby protecting ourselves and victimizing others.
Right.
Okay? If then Mary, full of grace, by the presence of the Holy Spirit, was freed from the fear of death and her faith in God was into eternity, she never had the motivation to commit an actual sin.
Right.
If the fear of death is taken away, the reason to sin
It's gone.
goes away. And I think that ties it up in a little kind of a bow there
Because all
for
that's
me.
left is love,
Right,
which is God.
right. Total abandonment
Total,
to, yeah, the lover, yeah.
And so I think the physical death, falling asleep, however you want to use that as a metaphor, image, etc., becomes less relevant as well. The point is that her end was the total union that she agreed to at the beginning, that she was destined for. Anyone else?
Well, I wasn't here last night, so I missed your introduction and everything.
Well, then you can't ask any questions.
I'm going to anyway. Everybody here knows about me. Okay, from my understanding, you were raised Roman Catholic, and you are now an Episcopal priest. How did that conversion happen? And because what I'm hearing to me is Roman Catholic theology.
Well, you're probably hearing a combination of Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Eastern. And I did teach moral theology from several different perspectives. How I became an Episcopalian was that from my beginning, I would say, at least my first communion, I recognized in myself that I was to be a priest, that I was to give this sacrament to others. And I spent a considerable amount of my life working through how to remain in a tradition that denied that, which I experienced as a tremendous reality. The seminary I went to was a Presbyterian seminary. I had an opportunity to become a Presbyterian minister. I was a Roman Catholic nun for a period of time. But most moral theology and a lot of liturgical theology really can't be understood in the Anglican tradition apart from, I think, the Roman history. Now, when you're going to talk about Mary, the development of theology around Mary has not been as significant, for a lot of different reasons, as in certain other traditions, either some of the various Eastern traditions or the Roman tradition. And so I think there's a lot of ways in which English Christianity, from which we inherit quite a bit, grew out of, let's face it, the English church. And in the Henrician Reformation, they didn't really see this necessarily as creating a new church. There was always an English church, an Irish church, a so on and so forth, that elected its own bishops, that worshiped in a particular way. And it was only after Rome began trying to impose, for political reasons, uniformity of rite, and not only the English, but the French and Spanish and anybody else that they could, the Irish, anybody else they could possibly coerce, and insisted on appointing their bishops from Rome and not by the local sovereign, that the tensions really grew. But eventually you find the English church adapting traditions that were earlier in the Latin tradition as it was experienced. You'll find the sacramentary, the forms of liturgy that Cranmer works with, coming internally, but still being influenced by what was at one time considered to be a universal tradition. You can look at Hooker and some of the Anglican divines, and look at Aquinas, and you'll see some convergences in the way natural law is thought of. But to talk about Mary without talking about the practice of the church across denominations is almost impossible, I find. So.
It's also the thought centered on Mary and reasoning based on these things is
Right.
You find small pockets of it in the Episcopal Church and in the Church of England, even if dogma hasn't been declared church-wide. It's greatly going to depend in the United States on whether you're near a Dominican or not. Our Dominican order tends to have a very strong Marian devotion and sort of a line of thought where we're willing to weave those reasonings into things. And I don't know if we're drawn to the Dominican order now because that's part of our conversation, so people who have that perspective are drawn in, or whether it's just the old Dominican conversation that we've jumped into that's affected us. Far more, the rosary and such in the upper Midwest, what they call the Beretta Belt. You've heard of the Bible Belt, right? Mm-hmm. Well, in the Episcopal Church, there's a place called the Beretta Belt, where the priests all wear the funny little hat and everybody says the rosary.
Springfield,
That's just
Illinois.
not New Mexico.
Springfield, Illinois is called the buckle of the Beretta Belt.
Wow. Well, this was the church I belonged to in Denver. When I was in nurses training.
And there's a
Was
place,
that?
there's a place in New York, Church of St. Mary the Virgin, which is known popularly as Smoky Mary's because of the amount of incense they use in various festivals. But for the Dominican order, we distinguish ourselves from the Roman Catholic order, but we do follow much of, we are patrons or fans of Thomas Aquinas and of the thinkers in that tradition and the Transcendental Thomists, and the Rosary was always an important issue. Now, the Rosary, again, has a long history in the Church, and it really is tied up, and I'm going to say, take a leap here, it's tied up with the inability of people to read and the inability of books, liturgical service books, etc., to be disseminated in somewhat the same way as the iconostasis is. What do I think about, how do I pray if I can't do this?
They didn't even have
They
those.
didn't have those. Monasteries developed offices that related back to the ways in which the Jewish tradition separated the day. They read this 150 Psalms at hours of the day. And the Cistercians actually developed something that they called the Marian Psalter, which was 150 paters, 150 Our Fathers, and then that grows into 150 Hail Marys, separated by Our Fathers, for the laity to do at different hours of the day. So that just as the monks are praying the Psalms in choir together, lay people are praying these very simple but affirming prayers of the faith. Now, if you ever tried to count to 150 over a 12-hour period of time, when you were also out farming and doing whatever, shoeing horses and things, slaying dragons, beasts, whatever. Guess what? I can count. I can divide it into tens, and I can also keep track. And we begin to include some other things like the Creed, the Gloria Patri, which is still said at the end of Psalms during the office. And at the end, usually a Marian antiphon of some sort. So there's nothing magical about the Rosary other than it was a way of allowing meditative and contemplative prayer. The idea of the mysteries of Christ's life, the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, and the glorious mysteries, all become, okay, today or this week we're doing these mysteries. What's his name? The guy I don't like. Pope Ratzinger. Benedict. Established yet another thing called the luminous mysteries, which were more about the public events of Jesus' ministry.
How many mysteries are there? As many as you want it to be?
15 or 20,
15 or
depending
20,
on.
depending on your-
Really? Okay.
Now, the Dominicans in the Rosary are interesting because there's a lot of legend or tradition, however you want to put that, around Dominic's devotion to Mary. At one point, his ministry, Dominic, I don't know if you probably have heard the stories of Dominic going into France to fight the Albigensians and sometimes called the Cathars, who believed, by the way, that the body was evil and only the soul counted. And Dominic had a tough time getting people to buy this. And presumably, the Blessed Mother appears to Dominic and says, pray the Rosary, and your ministry will be fruitful. And then, with the help of some of the papal armies, the Albigensians end up getting slain in large numbers, and his ministry really does take off. That's a very short and somewhat satirical version. But Dominic also has a vision of his order. Well, he has a vision of heaven, and in heaven he sees members of all of the orders of the church. And he doesn't see any friars or sisters from the Dominicans, from his order, which is horrible. And the Blessed Mother says, work again, and he sees this vision of her mantle spread, thusly, and in it is all of the members of his order. And they're contained and protected by her mantle. That's not the only mantle of Mary covering people vision that's ever happened, let me tell you, but that's a particular one in the Dominican tradition. So Mary does play a very important part in our order, and every night, as I said yesterday, we say the Salve Regina. If you were in a monastery or a chapter, you would say it together. And that happens in Dominican houses all over. So,
Say the what? What did you
the
call it?
Salve, the Hail Holy Queen,
Oh, okay, okay.
Salve Regina. Next.
I can understand the counting of the beads and helping people in repetitions and stuff. But why and or where did the story come from that Mary showed up and told somebody how to make a rosary and to pray these prayers?
I'm not sure if she is attributed with, we attribute almost everything to somebody else, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, tradition is kind of about being founded on somebody before you.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a specific time in which Mary appears to anybody and says, here, try this. As I said, it's an evolution of saying it, and then how do I keep track of it? And then
Yeah.
the Orthodox have a prayer rope that has knots, but not many of them. There's an Anglican rosary that has just the 10.
It's got 4 sets of 7. It's the 4 weeks of a month kind of thing. The Orthodox prayer rope will have 50 or 30, 50, or 100. And I think the whole idea is that if you're going to do something meditatively, it's just something to make sure you spend some time doing it. If you're going to say, like in the Eastern, at the monastery we were at St. Michael the Archangel, at one point during the 2 great offices of the Matins and Vespers, they will say 40 Lord have mercies. Okay, now, as monks who do it every day, they say them very, very fast. But if I'm going to say Lord have mercy on my set of 100 beads, it's not the 100 that's magic. It's the fact that I've set aside the time to do only that. And that's where I think a lot of the value comes in, is that the story is, the priest said, somebody said, what should I pray? I'm in a rush. He says, get up and say the Lord's Prayer before, and the man for a couple days said the Lord's Prayer, and for a couple days he got in a rush and he just said, Our Father, and then he got to the point where he was pointing at the plaque on the wall as he walked out. The beads make you not do that,
Yeah.
to some extent.
You have to
That's
stay
they're good psychology or physiology. They're not magic.
I
Yeah.
had a good friend who was a Roman Catholic priest who taught with me, and he was fond of telling the story that when he was in seminary, they told the young men, in case of temptation, do ejaculations.
Oh.
Which is an old word for immediate, quick prayers.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a word for other things also, which is what, of course, made the story amusing among young men.
I was thinking something else.
Some people have said that reverence is not necessarily one of my gifts. I don't know. Yes, it's not. The rosary itself is not a magical gift. But like anything else, if you attribute something to God, the Jewish tradition does this all the time. It came from God, or it came from Moses, or it came from whoever. Well, it came from Moses, like it came from, Joe next door. But you can't. But it gives it the weight.
Yeah.
And it's better than saying, this will help you keep count of the fact that you're praying and you don't skip on time. If you tell somebody that, they're like, hey.
So what's the difference?
So, right. And the rosary, of course, always begins and ends with the sign of the cross, which is always the most prominent part of the rosary. So,
Well, maybe we summarize.
do you want me to summarize?
I was offering.
Oh, yes, you could probably summarize more quickly than I could. because
I really
summarized
think
everything.
that the
Go on a bit.
discomfort of Marian devotion, Marian thought, Marian theology, I think a lot of that discomfort is removed if you think about it as the grace that saturates her because of God's intention, rather than the weirdness about original sin, sex, and virginity. If it's all about that weird little stuff, we all get uncomfortable, but again, as I have turned my back on the whole doctrine of original sin, it's not that Adam infected me with sin, he infected the world with death, therefore I'm afraid, therefore I sin. If God removed that fear from her and she is without sin and full of grace, it's not weird to me anymore.
When I was a young...
That sounds like what we've been sort of
Yeah.
the whole evening.
And remember, when I was a young theology student, a very, very wise woman who had written a lot about Mary, said, the one thing about Mariology you have to remember is that it's always about Christ. It's always Christological in nature. There's nothing we want to say about Mary that does not refer us to Christ, and that in turn does not then refer us to the body of Christ, the church. Mary,
Behold your son.
that's right. Mary is not about Mary. And if you think about it, much of what we've been talking about is about God, about Christ, about salvation, and about how we as the body experience things. And tomorrow we'll talk more about what does that mean for us. If the beginning is the beginning, and the end includes the beginning, what does that mean for each one of us who has a beginning and looks forward to an end? What do we say? May you rest in peace and rise up in glory. Okay?
Thank you.
And I promise that if you come back tomorrow, there'll be Sundays with a little cognac.